March 16th meeting of the Walpole School Building Committee. And our first order of business is acknowledgement of public participation and acknowledgement of the particular situation we find ourselves in with COVID. So I'm going to read a little statement here, if I could. Per Governor Baker's order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, Mass General Law GL 30A, Section 20, the public will not be allowed to physically access the school building committee meeting. Members of the public will be able to view this meeting on Walpole Media Cable Access. The school building committee reserves the right to implement additional remote participation procedures and will notify the public of these procedures as soon as practicable. Citizens with a question or comment should email mmortali at walpole.k12.mass.us. Thank you. So our next order of business is consideration and approval of the meeting minutes. So we have two sets of minutes to consider here. The first set of minutes is from January 26th, 2021. Do we have any questions or comments from the committee? Hearing none, I want to take a motion to approve the meeting minutes. Do I have any motions?
Motion to approve.
Okay, I have a motion from Mr. Schematic. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a second from Ms. Gayositz. So I am going to poll the committee. Dr. Goff.
Yes.
Mr. Friscia.
Yes.
Ms. Gallivan.
Yes.
Ms. Lawson.
Yes.
Mr. Jack Fisher.
Yes.
Mr. Connor.
Yes.
Mr. Hahn.
Yes.
Mr. Jeffrey Fisher.
Yes.
And Mr. Conroy.
Yes.
Did I miss anybody in there? Very good, it is a vote. And next, I'd like you to take a look, if you could please, at the February 23rd, 2021 minutes. Do we have any questions or comments? Hearing none, I will poll the committee. Actually, pardon me, I'd like to take a motion to approve the February 23rd, 2021 minutes. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
We have a motion from Ms. Gayositz. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a second from, I'm not sure who that was, Ms. Lawson?
Yes.
Very good, thank you. So again, I'm going to poll the committee. Dr. Goff.
Yes.
Mr. Friscia.
Yes.
Ms. Gallivan.
Yes.
Mr. Jack Fisher.
Sorry, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Schematic.
Yes.
Mr. Connor.
Yes.
Mr. Hahn.
Yes.
Mr. Jeffrey Fisher.
Yes.
And Mr. Conroy. And I
Yes.
vote yes as well. Thank you. And I vote yes as well. I'm sorry, Mr. Conroy, I cut you off there.
Mark,
So,
this is Jen.
Ms. Gayositz, I'm sorry, I missed you as well.
Yes.
And Ms. Lawson.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm
That's
navigating the feature. Ms. Lawson votes yes. Ms. Gayositz votes yes.
Yes.
And all right, very good. So I had missed a page on my screen here. Pardon me. So it is a vote. So our next order of business is to review and approve the vendor invoice packages from February 2021. Do we have any questions or comments?
Yeah, so just the two main invoices for this month, the Compass invoice, $15,206.25, and the Tap A invoice, $38,290 for a total of $53,496.25.
Any questions or comments from the board?
No, make a motion to approve.
Very good. We have a motion to approve from, I'm not sure who that was.
Yes, Fisher.
All right, Mr. Jeffrey Fisher, do we have a second?
Second.
Second from Ms. Gallivan. And again, let me poll the committee and hopefully I'll catch everybody this time. Mr. Schematic.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Connor.
Yes.
Ms. Gayos, pardon me.
Yes.
Mr. Jeffrey Fisher.
Yes.
Dr. Goff.
Yes.
Mr. Frisha.
Yes.
Ms. Gallivan.
Yes.
Ms. Lawson.
Yes.
Mr. Jack Fisher.
Yes.
And Mr. Hahn.
Yes.
And Mr. Conroy.
Yes.
Did I miss anybody this time? And I vote yes, it is a vote. So our next order of business on the agenda is the schematic design phase kickoff. There are a number of items here. And so with this, I will turn it over to Mr. Jarvis and or Mr. Pena to lead us through this, if they could.
Yep, thanks, Mark. Tony, are you controlling the slides, or is that Bridget?
Yeah, I'm controlling them.
Okay, good. Yeah, so tonight, update on the PSR, a couple things we want to accomplish. So the preferred schematic report that went in at the end of February, we'll give you an update on that. And we also want to go through some of the work we've been doing. At the last building committee meeting, we talked about the building layout of the B1 option, the square footage associated with it, some of the things we're going to look at following that meeting regarding square footage and how that can tighten up the building. We want to talk about what that means regarding project cost. And then also we do a quick overview on MSBA and eligible costs, how the MSBA calculates their reimbursement rate, how that applies to this project based on the current option. And we've also completed a preliminary tax impact with the help of the town. That's something that we'll be submitting to the MSBA in response to their comments on the PSR that we're expecting shortly. So we can go through that tonight. That way everyone's clear on what's currently constitutes the project, what we're thinking a potential reimbursement range might look like, and what that translates into a tax impact for the residents. So I'll go through everything. We have a lot of slides to get through. I'll go through everything to kind of put everything together and give you a big picture, and then we'll take some questions and we can discuss it once I get through all of the financial updates. And then we are going to talk a little bit about the schematic design work plan. We have a lot of work to accomplish between now and a July 7th submission of the schematic design, which will kick off kind of the final review and negotiations with the MSBA before we were to lock into a scope and budget agreement ahead of town meeting. So I'll get going, and then I'll pause at that point, and we can open up for discussion or questions. So PSR went in at the end of February, as we talked about. We are currently on the schedule for the MSBA's Facility Assessment Subcommittee, FAS, meeting on March 24th. We actually had a quick call with them today to go over a few project-related items. We have a logistics meeting with them tomorrow, and then we have a dry run of that FAS meeting next week ahead of the actual FAS meeting on the 24th. And at that meeting, that's where the district town reps, we're going to have the district, Mark and Mike Frisha attend TAP A and Compass, basically give a brief overview of the preferred schematics. So TAP A, Compass, and the district will present. And the FAS subcommittee is basically a subcommittee of not necessarily all MSBA staff that basically review the project and come up with any questions or concerns. They focus on a key few things. Things like sustainability, things like accessibility, some general questions on why this became the preferred schematic, how it relates to the ed plan, etc. So we have a brief 20-minute presentation, and then we'll go through some of their questions and comments. That subcommittee then, if everything checks out, they recommend approval of the preferred schematic to the MSBA board, and right now we're on schedule. We're targeting a board meeting with the MSBA on April 14th, at which point, if the MSBA approves Walpole's preferred schematic, then we officially move into schematic design phase, again with a targeted submission of July 7th. But some of that work has already started. TAP A's team has been working in the background with some things that can be started ahead of that approval that won't necessarily change. Next slide. So just a quick reminder or refresher, this is the B1 option that we talked about. So the 3-story elements, first floor, second floor, third floor, with the academic core kind of on the right side of the building. The front of the building is on the existing bird side of the new building. So the academic core on the right side, and the public core with the cafeteria, auditorium, and the gym in the library on the left side of the site. And you can see that the academic spaces stack above each other, so you can have a grade per floor. You could also do towers if you decided to do that with the grade stack vertically. But right now we're going with the grade per floor. Next slide. So we last saw you with the PSR submission. We had given you the top half of this slide, PDP, the preliminary development plan that we submitted back at the end of November. The building was approximately 173, just under 174 gross square feet. And then prior to the PSR submission, TAP A and the district had worked to help reduce that square footage down in a number of areas, prep rooms for science, eliminating chemical storage, reducing the size of principal's office, and eliminating separate lounge and teacher workrooms, which got us to a PSR square footage of 179.66, and that's what was submitted to the MSBA. And in comparison to the MSBA guidelines on the space summary that we had reviewed, that was approximately 26,000 gross square feet above the MSBA guidelines, mostly driven by the auditorium and the third gym space, as well as the third music space. So that's where it didn't align with the MSBA guidelines. There were some other overages and unders, but that was the main drivers. What's significant about that is, in that meeting, we also mentioned that we were looking at the size of the building to help drive down costs. We were concerned that the size of the building was going to be too big, too large, therefore too costly. And when you look at what was submitted, 179.66, the way to compare that to other schools is to compare the square footage per students. And the chart that you see at the bottom are actually the middle school projects that have gone through the MSBA process over the years for enrollments that are 800 students or more. So the larger middle school projects that are comparable to Walpole in size. And the Walpole size is shown to the right at 189 square feet per student. The average of these schools is 171, so we were significantly above the average middle school that was going through the MSBA process. I also highlighted the Natick and the Braintree middle schools that you might be familiar with. Some of you might have toured the Natick school or have at least an idea of the size of that building. They're about 182 square feet per student. Obviously that fluctuates based on the enrollment, but that kind of, the square foot per student levels those buildings across different enrollments. So Walpole was above average, so to speak, or even quite large compared to some other middle schools. So we knew that we needed to drive this down. And the way that that projects is that when you look at the costs, Tony, I don't know if this is the right slide at this spot. There you go. So when you look at that, the square footage of the PSR was 179.66 gross square footage, and we left you with possible recommendations of where we could find further reductions in the building size. We talked about looking at the classrooms. We talked about looking at the tech spaces. We talked about the central kitchen. We talked about the gym space, music classrooms, and the auditorium. The district did a great job working with TAP A to go back and take a hard look at a lot of these spaces to see if there was ways to reduce or make some spaces more efficient. And what they came up with was a list of recommendations to help bring the building size down. They're recommending reducing the size of general classrooms about 50 square feet down to 900 square feet. The MSBA allows between 850 and 950, so bringing it down from 950 to 900. They recommended combining or reducing of 1,440 square feet in a tech or media space. So we had an additional tech room, but the possibility is that we're going to maybe use that, make some of that space in the media center, or just eliminate that additional tech room. They recommended reducing the size of the central kitchen and working with the cafeteria in the central kitchen so there would be no square footage overage compared to the MSBA's guidelines for the dining and kitchen space, which we accomplished. Recommend keeping the third gym space. This space is possibly eligible for the reimbursement for the MSBA review, and we'll get into some of those details a little bit later. It's based on the ED program. You basically, combining two schools of enrollment into the middle school, and the MSBA only gives you a 6,000 square foot gym for a middle school, and the third gym space would provide approximately another 3,000 square feet for a third flexible gym space. They're also recommending reducing one music classroom to go down from 3 classrooms to 2 classrooms. and then use the auditorium stage as a space for that third music classroom. I think it's orchestra. And they're also recommending staying with the dedicated 600-seat auditorium. And as we've talked about in the past, these spaces in a middle school are categorically ineligible for reimbursement. If all those recommendations are accepted, then that drives the square footage of the building down to approximately 159,000, just under 160,000, much closer to the MSBA guidelines, and again driven mostly by the auditorium and the third gym space when you add in the grossing square factor. So a very tight, efficient building in comparison to the guidelines. Next slide. And this shows you kind of the process that we've gone through. So looking at the MSBA template averages about 161 square feet per student. And again, that's based on the MSB guidelines. So that's using a cafeteria that's only 6,000 square feet for a gym, so basically 2 teaching stations, and it only provides 36 core academic spaces. So in the Walpole's case, where they have teaming per grades, we actually need a few more academic spaces, which drives up our square footage slightly. The model school in Lynn, which we saw in the earlier slide, which is the middle school that the MSBA uses as one of their models, which would be the biggest model that would fit the Walpole curriculum, is approximately 165 per square feet, and then the average of the middle schools that we saw on that previous slide for 800 students is about 171 square feet per student. So the Walpole process, starting at the bottom, we were at 192 for PDP, PSR was 189, and just for reference, Natick and Braintree was 182, and we continued to work through scenarios until we came up with what is the current recommendation to move into schematic design with is 177 square feet per student. So that's the academic modifications that we just talked through, classrooms at 900 square feet, zeroing out the kitchen and cafeteria spaces so they're not over the MSBA guidelines, but keeping the third gym space and the 600-seat auditorium. And that gets us to an average of 177. So why is that important? So a refresher on MSBA and eligible costs, I think we talked about this in one of the first meetings. The MSBA looks at all the costs on a project, and they have different categories of how they deem costs to be ineligible. There's 3 general categories. Things are categorically ineligible, meaning they're not part of the core educational program. Costs that are not part of the permanent building or the grounds, and costs beyond the project scope for categorically ineligible. The example here is the auditorium is categorically ineligible in a middle school program. The second category is costs that exceed MSBA caps. The MSBA sets caps for each project of what they're willing to participate in, meaning the amount they're willing to reimburse up to. If project costs exceed those particular caps, then they deem the costs that go above those caps to be ineligible for reimbursement. And then finally, you have costs for spaces that exceed guidelines. So you have a space that, per the MSBA, is an eligible space, but you might have too many of them, or the space might be too big, and that space, therefore, the quantity exceeds what the MSBA has in their guidelines, and they find that space to potentially ineligible. Now, they review it, and based on your education program, a lot of times they find some of those spaces to be eligible. For example, the core academic spaces or special education spaces are fairly district specific, and if a strong case is made in the education program, a lot of times they find those exceedances to be eligible, but it is up to MSBA review, and they have to be approved by the staff. Next slide. And again, some examples: categorically ineligible project costs. It's just not construction costs. The land acquisition, legal fees, any off-site type improvements, swing space. We had talked about that in some of the earlier concepts. Local board costs, remediation of asbestos floor tiles, the auditorium in elementary and middle schools, and synthetic turf. Cost caps for the MSBA, total soft costs exceeding 20%. So when you add up OPM, design, administrative, contingency, furniture, all of those costs, if they exceed 20% of the construction costs, that exceedance is deemed ineligible. OPM costs exceeding 3.5% of construction, architect's costs exceeding 10%. The big one is building costs exceeding $333 per square foot, and we'll talk about this more in a minute. But this is really a driving factor in today's market, and a big factor in what's driving the realized reimbursement rate for the MSBA. We also have a cost cap on site costs, and this is a way that they try to level projects across different districts with whether or not buildings have a lot of site costs associated with them. If the site costs exceed 8%, then anything above that 8% is deemed ineligible. They also put a cap on furniture and technology. They give you $1,200 per student for each category, so $2,400 total. A lot of districts spend over that. It's very difficult to outfit some of these buildings for just $1,200 per student with furniture. So anything over that $2,400 cap is deemed ineligible. And then during construction, change orders, they'll actually review every change order, and then they will reimburse eligible change orders, and they'll up to 1% of construction cost. After that, regardless of what the change order is for, above that 1% is deemed ineligible. And then finally, costs for the spaces that exceed guidelines. Again, this is per MSBA review, and they're deemed ineligible with review of the ED program, whether or not the ED program supports it. The two examples that we have here are the core academic and the special ed spaces most likely would be eligible in this project. And the third gym space possibly will be eligible, but there's a good chance that it'll be found ineligible. Next slide. So how do they use that to come up with your reimbursement rate? So as you're familiar with, the MSBA agrees to reimburse the district at a stated rate, which is a base rate plus incentives for all eligible project costs. And as we just saw, not overall total project costs. So not all project costs are considered eligible for reimbursement. The effective reimbursement rate is always less than that stated reimbursement rate due to those ineligible costs. So for instance, Walpole's stated base rate at this point is just under 49% at 48.68. We feel that through the design process and when we get to scope and budget agreement, we'll most likely see an additional 3 to 4 points in incentives, which could get that stated rate up to 51 or 52% reimbursement. Next slide. However, they take that reimbursement rate and then they apply it to what's eligible in the project. So they take your total project costs, they subtract out ineligible construction costs, either it's categorically ineligible like a turf field, or it's over a cap like on the site work. They take out your ineligible soft costs, so that's related to legal fees or something that might be over for your FF&E, and they come up with what they call total eligible project costs, and that's what they base the reimbursement rate against. So then they take that total eligible project cost, multiply it by your stated rate, and then you get your estimated maximum total facilities grant. So that's, they're saying there is that this is the maximum amount that we'll reimburse you based on the eligible costs on the project. And that estimated maximum total facilities grant, they review that throughout the entire project. So they're auditing everything that we send into them on a monthly basis. They're auditing against their original findings, and they sometimes deem additional costs to be ineligible. So that estimated maximum grant is the most you'll ever get. You typically don't see that, and you typically see below that by the time the project is done. So you take the total project costs, you minus your estimated maximum total facilities grant, what they're going to give you in reimbursement, and that leaves you with the town share, or what the town has to pay for the total project. So we ran a preliminary MSBA total project budget to get to town shares for some of the square footages that we just talked about. So the current B1 concept at roughly 160,000 square feet with the auditorium and the third gym, when you plug that into the MSBA template, that spits out a total project cost of about 116 million. We were carrying roughly 30% in soft costs for the estimate. When we actually plug in all of the soft costs up against the cap and put in placeholders for some of the budget items on the MSBA's form, we actually brought that cost down a little bit, which spits out an estimated MSBA maximum facilities grant of roughly $67 million. So that's them looking at a $116 million project and deeming 67 million of it is eligible for reimbursement. So when they do that model, that says that the town share at the end of the day is going to be roughly $80 million. So that gives you an effective reimbursement rate of 31%. So we've started this calculation at roughly 51 or 52 by the time you get through all of the ineligible costs, things that exceed the cap, things that are categorically ineligible. The MSBA is looking at that $67 million number and giving you 52% of that, which is roughly 30-something million dollars. So 116 minus that 30 gives you a share of $80 million. The B1 concept, just for comparison with a cafetorium, meaning you don't do the auditorium because it's categorically ineligible, gives you a total project cost of roughly 112 million, and then the same calculations apply. Because it's the cafetorium, a little bit more of it's eligible for reimbursement from the MSBA. Estimated town share is roughly 74 million, and the effective rate is about 34%. Next slide. So we had the town finance department run a few simulations based on these town shares. So the 80 million shares we saw on the previous slide is the current B1 option with an auditorium, with a third gym space at a relative 31% reimbursement from the MSBA, leaves the town with about $80 million to fund themselves. 75 million is the cafetorium option, and we're carrying 85 million. Obviously, if things change during design, or if you get a bad bid or a high bid, what that share might look like. They base that on the average residential value of property in Walpole, which is just over $550,000, and assuming a 30-year level debt funding at 3.5%, which is fairly conservative, but we're talking, this is a little ways down the road, gives you a range of tax impact for those three shares, anywhere between 423, 450, and 478. So, and you can see the chart below with the average assessed value, how that changes per taxpayer, but that's the highlighted is the average for the taxpayer in Walpole. So the takeaway from this slide is that the reimbursement rate anywhere between 31 to 34%. The MSBA is going to give you an average tax impact to the taxpayer of approximately 423 to 450. Going from an auditorium to no auditorium on the average taxpayer is roughly $27, but the total range is anywhere from $15 up to about $60, depending on your tax bracket. Next slide. Tony, can you go back to the MSBA chart? I'll end with that one. So this slide is important because this is the MSBA charting new construction costs through their program over the years, starting, it's small print, but starting at the bottom left, you're 2009. The dates circled in yellow are our current dates. That's January of 21, July of 21. And then the vertical blue bar is our projected bid time at the end of 2020. And what you see on this chart is the MSBA tracking all of their school projects and the construction cost per square foot. The orange line, and it's dotted where we've kind of extrapolated what that looks like over the last 2 years, is the average cost dollars per square foot of new school construction in Massachusetts through the MSBA. The solid orange squares represent projects that happened through the MSBA. They received the bid and they executed the project funding agreement. They updated it with the bid information, so those projects are locked in with the MSBA. The orange squares that are not filled in are current bids that have been received, and they're just going through the final paperwork with the MSBA to update their funding agreement to reflect those bids. The blue squares that aren't filled in are schematic design estimates. So that's the estimate that the MSBA uses to lock in the scope and budget agreement with districts. And then the pluses are the PSR estimates, which is what stage we're currently at. So you can see in the last 7 years alone, basically, you've seen almost a 50% jump in cost per square foot. And you see how rapidly that's risen in the last few years due to escalation in construction costs. The blue dot on that line represents where we were with PSR at the larger building at 170,000 square feet. We were just under, just over $440 per square foot proposed. So we're slightly below average, or projected average of where school construction is going to be, which we think is a good thing. The other thing to note, and this is what we talked about earlier, is the red dotted arrow, which connects that orange line down to the green line. The green line is this dollars per square foot that the MSBA reimburses at. So that's their cap on construction costs. So when they look at a project and they say Walpole's construction cost is $543 per square foot, they're only going to reimburse $333 of that. So the trend is that the market cost of construction has far outpaced what the MSBA is reimbursing. and that ends up driving that effective reimbursement rate down for districts. So this is not a unique problem just to Walpole. This isn't necessarily reflective of our project. The $52 being reimbursed at closer to 30. The biggest driving factor of that is the discrepancy here between what the MSBA reimburses construction cost at versus the actual market costs. But what you can take away from this slide is that the current project is in line and slightly below the projected average of school costs. So right now we feel that we have a very efficient building, a cost-effective building, and we're still tightening up some of the aspects of it. So a lot of information. Any questions there, concerns? You can go back to any of the slides. We just want to make sure, so the goal tonight is just to make sure everyone is on board, everyone understands where we are square footage wise, where we are cost wise. We'll continue to refine this. We are doing one more, we're doing 2 more estimates at the end of schematic design that will reconcile, and that'll be the final cost estimate that'll get submitted to the MSBA. And that's the estimate and the gross square footage that the MSBA will then negotiate a scope and a budget agreement with the town and lock in that final starting reimbursement, and also lock in the items that are deemed to be ineligible in the project. So any questions?
Jen has her hand up.
Ms. Gailsons.
Yeah, I just wanted to get a little more information on the size of the classrooms. I know you reduced it by 50 square feet each, and I just wanted to hear the rationale behind that.
Yeah, so that's a recommendation. I'll turn that over to Bill or Bridget.
I can start. So the first thing is that we examined was that the 900 square foot classroom we thought was still a huge improvement and plenty of space for our student and for what will be our projected average per pupil classroom size. We visited actually Natick most recently and looked at their square footage of 900 square feet, which what their classrooms were set at, and felt compared to our current middle school where the average class size is below 900 square feet, and felt that the space was, I don't want to use the word adequate because it was far beyond adequate, and will meet the needs of our educational plan.
Jen, we also went down and measured too. So we wanted to see the actual difference and take a look at the rooms when the kids weren't in the building, and then comparing it to when we went to Natick and looking at the difference between. We also took out, like in the science lab, some of the prep rooms because we felt that the prep rooms for those spaces, that the science classrooms were adequate enough. And in one, the grade 8, I think, right, Bill, that's the one that needed a certain prep room for the chemicals that they use.
Yeah, for the science rooms, we transitioned the prep spaces into prep closets, so each of the grade level neighborhoods would have adequate space for storage, but we thought the 1,440 square foot, Brian, I didn't correct me wrong, I think it's around 1,400 square feet is the science room, would provide adequate prep space for the teachers, which is why we got rid of the room and transitioned to a closet.
Yeah, so the MSBA changed their requirements in the last, since 2018. They treat a middle school science lab the same as a high school science lab. It's really based on square foot per student at 60 square feet per student at 24 kids per classroom. So they want the middle school science labs to be 1,440, which are huge for a middle school. The Natick building that we just finished up, they were under the old guidelines, and I think those are in it like 1,280. So the science lab, these are bigger than the Natick lab, and that's a requirement for the MSBA. So,
and as Brian, as a point of comparison for Walpole residents, the current, whenever the high school science edition was completed, those rooms are actually under 900 square feet. So you can see how those have changed, and the square footage regulations have changed.
right.
Any follow-up questions, Ms. Gailsons? Very good, thank you. Mr. Jack Fisher, you had a hand up. Mr. Fisher? right, we'll move on to Mr. Senek. You had a hand up as well.
Yeah, Brian, I had a question regarding how the MSBA determines what a fair construction cost would be. How they making the determinations from material costs to current economic status.
How do they come up with the 333?
Yeah.
I mean, Tim might be able to explain that a little bit better, but they basically come up with their calculation with, it's not necessarily driven what they think the cost should be. That's just the reimbursement level that they're saying that they're willing to reimburse at. And I think it has a lot to do with how they try to spread their funds to be able to do some additional projects or with additional districts. But it's not the MSBA saying, oh, we think you could build it for 333. They're just saying we're willing to participate up to 333. They did increase it a few years ago, but it was at 326, so it's not, and it hasn't kept pace with inflation for sure.
See, at one time, if you go back at that, if you look at that, at one time in 2010 and 11, when they started setting these caps, they were pretty close. In fact, you could get a building built for that, but they decided not to try to keep pace with construction inflation, and eventually just decided that they needed to make sure they had enough money. They have a limited bucket of available money to spread around to as many communities as possible. So as Brian said, they no longer even try to explain that you can build a school for that cap. They say you should try to build a school as efficiently and least expensive as possible per square foot, so you limit that overage, but they don't try to. Then they're not seeing. I don't think there's even a school, as you can see, there's not a school that ever hit the cap. There was one, I guess, in 2018 or 17, but that's so that they don't make an effort to try to explain that anymore, other than it being equity and trying to distribute money.
Anything else, Mr. Senek?
Nope, that's it. Thank you.
Very good. Mr. Fisher, if you could, please.
Yeah, sorry, I tried to talk and I was muted. Brian, a couple questions. One of the things that you mentioned when you were talking about the reimbursement rates, what kinds of incentives would we be able to adopt that would increase the reimbursement rate?
They have a handful. They've gotten rid of a few over the past few years. Like they used to give you the incentive for the model school. They used to give you the incentive for doing CM at risk. The two that we have targeted right now is that they give you an incentive for a maintenance program. So basically ensuring that you have an ongoing maintenance program for the new building. And then there's also an incentive for higher energy efficiency in some of the HVAC systems or in the MEP systems. So typically when we design, to a base efficiency rating or sustainability rating, we'll design it at a level that's going to get those 2%. So that's what we're factoring in right now. We haven't seen a full 2% reimbursement on that maintenance. We typically see it somewhere in the 1 point something, but we do typically get those 2 extra points for the energy efficiency. So we're going to see, right now we're projecting we'll see 3 point something additional points on top of that base rate.
All right, that energy efficiency is not a LEED certification, right?
It's not certification, no, but they require the building to be designed to a certification level. You don't necessarily have to get certification to get those 2 points. Those 2 points are related to the energy efficiency that was.
Ryan, you do need to get the LEED certification. You don't have to get silver, but
you don't have to get silver, right? So you have to get the base certification, Jack. I'm sorry, I was referring to silver.
That takes a while and usually holds up getting the final audit.
Yeah, so you'll get a base LEED. You'll get a base LEED certification. Typically, it gets designed to roughly a silver level, so you have some buffer. But that silver level also includes that higher efficiency component that gets you the incentive points.
But what we will have to do is account for the cost of actually going through the certification process, though.
Right, that'll get written in to the construction project. The contractor will have some clerical cost in doing that. We have some costs with applying for the LEED certification. It's usually fairly minimal in the grand scheme of things, but there will be some cost related to that.
Okay, and I have one other question. If you look at where you are right now, you're down to about 160,000 square feet. which is still about 10% more than the average, I believe. I can't remember exactly what the average, I think you said was.
Yeah, maybe the slide before this, Tony.
Right, but anyway, we're about 10% more than the average, and is that 10%
One more.
primarily accounted for with the cafeteria versus the full auditorium, or what?
So
That's
this
a
slide
lot.
here, Jack.
Yeah,
Yeah, so the difference here between the guidelines, so the 159,958, and Chris can explain in more detail compared to the MSBA's 144. What's driving that right now would be the auditorium, because the guideline for the MSBA, they don't include an auditorium, so their guideline is 0. And then you have the third gym space. So in the gym guidelines, they give you 6,000 square feet, and we're at roughly 9,000 square feet for gym space. So that's about 10,000 square feet, and then we have a handful of additional spaces throughout, like in special education or the core academic spaces. We have a handful more classrooms than what the MSBA guidelines allow due to the district's team teaching model and setup of the classrooms.
okay, no,
Chris can
that's all right.
explain that a little better.
Okay, basically what you're saying is, of the 10% overage, about 2/3 of that is for the cafetorium and the extra gymnasium. That's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
No, so the cafetorium, it's the auditorium and the
That's
extra gym space. Yeah, the cafetorium
Okay.
would eliminate the auditorium, and you'd have a stage in your cafeteria, which is what the MSBA considers their guidelines for a middle school.
Okay,
Does that
thank
make
you.
sense?
Yeah,
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Ms. Gallivan, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is related to the decision about the third gym and the cafetorium versus the auditorium. When does that decision need to be made? I understand you're saying it's about a difference of $50 to the average taxpayer, and I could make an argument for why it would be good to have that, but do we need to sort of flesh that out tonight, or is that something that we'll get we'll have a little bit more time with?
No, we want to flesh it out tonight, because we really need to have TAP A continue to move forward with the space summary that comes out of tonight's program. I mean, if we start to make those types of changes, it is going to set them back as far as our schematic design schedule.
I just wanted to add that the delta between right now, the cafetorium versus auditorium, is an average of $25 per taxpayer. The $50 is if we get to 85 million, but the number here,
Good point,
Yep.
Tony. Sorry, my
this
mistake.
is like a $25 difference, sorry.
27, yep.
I think, I definitely think that we should have some serious discussion about that, because if this is the only school that Walpole has built from new, or if we hopefully are able to do this, and it really might make sense to spend that extra money, so long as we will have to be clear about the decision, but to have a high quality auditorium that can serve the school system and also the town might make sense for that $27 per average taxpayer worth of difference. I guess the other thing that I think about having an auditorium with a stage not connected to the cafeteria makes sense when we gave up a music room. As I understand it, the idea is that the stage would become the place where the orchestra or some music classes would be held on purpose, and so that's something that I think needs to get considered in terms of why it might make sense to consider the auditorium. And then the other piece that I would say is, I think we have to talk it through a little bit more, but the extra gym space, what I remember seeing when we looked at other schools that have had an extra room was they were able to use it for their special needs students that needed occupational therapy or adaptive PE. They were also able to use it in some kind of interesting and forward-thinking ways of teaching wellness, and just not the typical kinds of PE classes that maybe we had when we were in school. So, you know, I'm interested in what other people have to say, but I think that it might make sense to consider those rooms because I think they'd be well used. My other question is, Jack Fisher was just asking about what kind of environmental consideration. I know that we got a question from some people who are on the Walpole Environmental Committee or something like that. Is that a decision that we can still keep open after tonight, or are we locked into making a decision before we've actually heard from them?
No, we're not making those decisions tonight, Nancy. We're going to have a bunch of meetings related to the sustainability level and some of the green aspects of the project coming up. And I think, like we just talked about, I think most folks are going to be pleasantly surprised at the current kind of base level of design that goes into these buildings these days. I think it's going to answer a lot of their questions. So I think we wanted to kind of get through this part, and then they'll be kind of brought in once we're able to kind of make those presentations. But that'll be happening over the next few months.
Great, thank you.
Brian, do you want me to take this opportunity to explain a little bit of one of Nancy's questions were about the spaces for the gym and then also the spaces, the reduction of the music space?
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right.
Phil, I can jump into it.
Okay. So to start with the music space, it's important to point out that our middle schools offer 4 different music options: a general music, an orchestra, a chorus, and a band. So we initially had, as Brian pointed out, 3 music rooms that were necessary to implement our education plan and our program. When we considered the auditorium space and decided to reduce one of the 3 music rooms, one of our programs would need to move to the stage of the auditorium, so this would be a utilized space. The details of which, whether that would be band, orchestra, or even potentially chorus, depending on the space itself, we did not discuss those details. So Nancy alluded to that, so I wanted to make sure I shared that is the programmatic need for the robust music program that we currently offer. The other thing in terms of the gym space, and I'm only saying this for my own point of clarity because I know it confused me at first. When we talk about 3 gym spaces, we're not talking about 3 gyms. The larger gym offers 2 spaces. And for those of you who know that, that's great. I was confused by that, so I just want to point it out. So it's 1 gym offers 2 spaces, and then the third would be the auxiliary gym. That is the smaller one off to the side. And as Nancy said, this is really important. We have a very strong, robust inclusion special education program. This gym would meet our health and wellness needs in the curriculum as directed by our ed plan, but it should also be noted that it'll meet the needs of our special education students, providing them with actually vocational opportunities and OT and PT space that is critical to the success of those programs. So that gym is a very important. That third gym has both curriculum and educational programs related, and then also a huge part of our special ed program. Bridget, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, just the only other thing to add that sometimes we forget about, because we talk so much about the auditorium, and I'm glad that you mentioned that the music program, because we do have a robust music program. A lot of middle schools do not offer something like orchestra, and every student, like you mentioned, takes a music class. But when you're looking at the actual cafeteria, that's also utilized to provide vocational opportunities for our special ed programming. Robust inclusion programmatic structure that we have for our special education students, and that space supports job training, hands-on learning for our special education students, and this partnership it's integral part of our inclusion program. So I wanted to add that as well.
Yeah, I will point out that these are the floor plans that were submitted. I mean, since then, one of the blue music spaces on the first floor, as Bill mentioned, has been eliminated. So the floor plan has tightened up a little bit, and that space is what will be held on the stage. Anything else? Any other questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
All right. Ryan, I just want to be clear on something. When you said the auditorium, they don't reimburse it. Do you count that square footage in with the whole thing, or is that just kind of like set aside? Meaning, since they don't pay for it, it wouldn't be part of the gross square foot.
No, the auditorium. So if we're saying the current square footage with an auditorium is 159,000.
Yeah.
That includes the auditorium square footage. But
Okay.
when that goes into the MSBA budget, they look at spaces that are ineligible and they deduct that square footage from their calculation. So they take the 8,000 out for an auditorium, and now they're looking at 151,000 square feet.
Okay, so it's taken out after, so the gross square foot, and then they take out, okay.
Yeah, what you see here is the actual square footage of the project. The MSBA reduces their square footage that they reimburse by, then they apply that $333 to whatever they come up with for square footage.
And my only other comment regarding when you go to this lead stuff, this time around, I would like to see what the cost is to achieve it versus the payback. We didn't see that on the library, and we don't necessarily need to go for gold if it's going to cost us money. If we meet what we're supposed to meet, that's fine, but you know, there's a lot of diminishing returns on this stuff, and that's one thing I think we'd have to see.
Yeah, agreed. It's the sustainability is a rabbit hole that can quickly drive up your capital costs and not get a lot of return on investment. Right now, we're not at that net zero ready type of level. And Chris and Charlie can add more detail if we need it. But I mean, our base right now is to go to the level of certification that gets us those extra 2 reimbursement points from the state, which will more than offset the couple $1,000 that's going to take to get the certification.
Okay, man, it's my last comment. I don't know if Donnie's on tonight, Anderson.
He's not.
Okay, I won't speak for him, but he's always been in the mindset, and I agree 100%. I don't know if they had plans to put any solar panels on the roof, but that's not a good idea. Because you get leaks or you get snow, you're just asking for trouble. And if you look at most of the people who put them on their roofs, they're mostly when the snow's there, they're covered, so they ain't working very well. But a few years ago, we went through it, and you had a hell of a time at the library when we got that like 4 feet of snow. And as you guys would know, Brian and Tony, you get a leak up there with that stuff, it makes it even harder. So I'm not speaking for Donnie, but I just agree that let's not even think of putting any on the roof.
Hey, Jack, I just, the current codes require us to make the roof solar ready, but that doesn't mean you have to put stuff up there. just to clarify, if you hear us say it's solar ready, it's not because we're advocating necessarily, it's just because it's a code requirement.
Yeah, solar ready is you got some clips up there that they attach the post to, is that what you mean?
It's conduits from the roof down to the room for the inverters, but it's also sizing the structure so that it can support the weight of a potential solar array. So, but that's required now in the stretch codes. You have to accommodate the means for putting solar on roofs.
Okay, but we don't have to put the panels up there. Okay.
You don't have to put the panels, and it doesn't mean you have to put any like clips or stanchions or anything through the roof membrane. It just means it has to ready for in case someone wants to do it later. So.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Can I just quickly speak to the auditorium versus cafetorium points? I came from a middle school that had a cafetorium, and we had constant challenges presented by that arrangement. You know, the school committee at our next meeting is going to be able to hear from the middle school drama clubs, and we have a very robust drama program as well. And to have that, be able to have a standalone area to be able to have their productions in and not have to worry about moving things in and out of the cafeteria every rehearsal, every practice, every performance is a huge thing for them. Also, when we use spaces like the cafeteria for testing locations or for assemblies, if it's a combination, if it's a cafetorium, it becomes a competing space issue, as well as if there is a wall or a curtain, no matter how good it is for the cafetorium setup, there's always going to be acoustical bleed into the cafeteria or vice versa. And so there were just constant challenges with it. And so if we are able to swing the auditorium, I think that's a much preferred option, especially given our programming.
Thanks.
Mark, you're on mute.
Mr. Morganwood, Ms. Gayosis, please.
I just wanted to also say that some of these spaces we're talking about will lead to revenue that, overall will change the budget for the schools going forward, or change the town's budget in terms of, being able to charge user fees for some of these spaces. So, for instance, having an auditorium, there's places in town like dance studios that go to neighboring towns and would use our space. I know for town meeting, we've had problems finding space because, sometimes the high school auditorium's been used. So I think having an additional space like this would be very beneficial. And then one other thought in terms of cost savings is just our special ed. We were talking a little bit about the fact that some of these spaces are going to be used for our special ed programs. And I did just want to mention that Walpole has done a great job, and that's something that, over the years, we've really looked at how to bring some of these different special education programs in-house versus, paying costs of sending students out of the district. And so there's cost savings there as well. So these additional spaces, as they mentioned, some of these can be used for those purposes. So there's just some other considerations we want to think about in terms of revenue streams and saving revenue that, we may be paying it out on the building, but we may be having revenue implications in other places.
Thank you, Ms. Gales. It's Ms. Lawson. You had a hand up.
Now, I want to speak in favor of having a real auditorium as opposed to cafetorium. My kids went to Bird, where they had a cafetorium. We have had wonderful music programs, and I think it's the preferred performance venue for music is in a amphitheater, is in an auditorium. And I think Nancy mentioned this earlier, if we're going to be building a school, I think it makes sense to do it right, and to not be later on kicking ourselves, we should have put an auditorium in. It may be revenue generating, but that's not where I'm coming from. I'm looking strictly at I consider music to be academic, part of the academic program, and I really think it's important to have an auditorium for the acoustics and for the I think when you try to combine the cafetorium, it's neither a good cafeteria nor a good auditorium. So I like to see us do it right. I think it's worth the extra money to have the auditorium. It's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Ms. Lawson. Ms. Santiago Taylor, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I'm sorry I was late earlier today. I definitely agree with having the cafeteria having separate facilities, the cafeteria and the auditorium. Again, this is a building that we're not building for right now. We're building for the next, 30, 40, 50 years. So we need to consider the long term. In music, art, all of that is part of our education system. We can't have fully developed children and youth without those components. So we need it separate. And then we can revisit the solar panels later.
Thank you, Ms. Santiago Taylor. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? None at all. So I guess, Mr. Jarvis, I'll turn it back over to you. Do we have anything else?
Thanks. Yeah, so we just wanted everyone to understand kind of where the design is now heading into schematic design. Everyone's on the same page as far as the types of spaces and what that means at the end of the day financially for the town. We think the district has come up with a lot of good recommendations to make this an efficient building in comparison to some other projects that are out there with the MSBA, and also on behalf of the taxpayers to try to get a most cost-effective solution. So I think they've done a lot of good work, and I think we wanted to make sure the committee was aware of what's going on and had a chance to discuss it so everyone could get their questions answered. So thank you for the time. We don't need to do any votes or anything of that nature because this is still the option that's moving forward. It's just clarifying some of the pieces and the financials of it. And I'll just finish out, and maybe Tony can talk through the work plan, but just an update of where we are. We mentioned this briefly in the beginning. The goal is to get the schematic design report submitted to the MSBA by July 7th. So we have a lot of work between now and then. As I mentioned, we'll continue to fully vet out some of those topics we talked about regarding sustainability, regarding some of the programming that goes into the space, meeting with the district and different town departments, such as public safety, again, facilities, kind of getting more of those inputs as we start to put together the narratives and the scope of this, the schematic scope of this building. There'll be 2 more cost estimates. We will be doing one. TAPA's estimator will be doing one. We'll reconcile those. We'll get all that information into the schematic design report, which will be presented to this committee at the end of June. That gets submitted first week of July, and the goal is to get to an MSBA board approval, which would include a scope and budget agreement, which will have project scope, project budget, the negotiated reimbursement rate by the end of August. So coming out of the summer, we'll have final project information from an MSBA perspective, which will then start kind of that fall approach to town meeting and town vote of getting in front of all of the residents and taxpayers with project information. We'll be going a lot of community forums, a lot of special interest group meetings, whatever we need to do publicly to get all that information out ahead of town meeting. Next slide. And you've seen this before, so now we're moving into the yellow phase. So these are the more in-depth analysis, at least down to a schematic design level, which will get us to roughly 30% of the overall design. But the big takeaways at the end will be the updated construction cost estimates, which is what the MSBA is going to make us live with, which will be applied to come up with a total project budget, our maximum reimbursement, estimated facilities grant, and then a project schedule. So all of those items will get rolled into that submission in early July. So how do we get there? Tony will walk us through quickly the work plan and highlighting the building committee meetings and what we're intending to talk about at each of those.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add. I did send this out as an attachment. Various committee members did want to kind of have a proposed agenda for each meeting so that they can understand kind of the roadmap of what we need to consider. I know you've heard this before, but we did tighten up on TAPA by 1 month. So originally we were going to be submitting this SD report in August. Unfortunately, the MSBA does not meet in September, so we were going to be getting a vote and the details of the project funding agreement kind of late for preparing a campaign for town meeting, which is obviously going to be a very critical component to getting a good result on a vote. So this has been tightened up for a submission in July so that we can get an August board vote and have September and part of October to get this out to the community and really explain to them. So because of that, we're here now. The doors of a fast-moving train have just opened, and we're about to get on with the space summary and the template and the square footages that you all agreed to tonight. So in order to get to the 7th, we really need every single one of these yellow meetings because we won't be able to double back really on some of these discussions. When we get to the May and the June meetings, these are going to be critical to talk about a value engineering list, so we can identify items ahead of time that we might be able to talk about compromising if the cost estimates come in way more than what we thought or something happens. So we'll try to establish a list ahead of time and allow those cost estimates to come in, and then we're going to consider the cost estimates in June and go through the actual draft submission before we do that. The estimators really do need 3 weeks, and then we take the 2 estimates, and there's a whole process of sitting around a table making sure everyone's comparing apples to apples. So our plan right now is to tackle the draft submission, which you've seen this process before, where we look at table of contents and we kind of give you an idea of what we're submitting, so that we can get through that ahead of time and then really get in the nitty gritty on the cost at the end of June, and then be ready to submit and vote to you all on the 6th. The 6th won't be any new information. It'll just be any last questions, any review of the document, and then we're kind of on a tight timeline here with some different approvals by school committee and endorsement, more than a vote, and also by the select board. So as we get closer to the end of June, these are going to tighten up. So at the end of tonight, if everybody agrees to these meetings, just look at your schedules. I want to make sure also that we haven't booked meetings on other committee nights. So we have the end of March, we have a meeting on the 13th and on the 27th of April, and then we have only 1 meeting in May and then 2 meetings in June, and then we have the final meeting in July. So at the end of this, I will go through the Outlook calendar and actually attribute the 7 o'clock time and confirm all those meetings. And then we're just going to work as hard as we can until we get to the end.
Ms. Santiago Taylor, I believe you had a hand.
Yeah, so I can't find, so are we going to have, I want to give some more feedback on bathroom situation in the building. It's really hard for me to see the pictures, but it looked like there were only 3 bathrooms per floor. And I just want to make sure that there's going to be a gender neutral bathroom per floor for kids.
There's a pod of bathrooms for each neighborhood, and that consists of a boys, a girls, and a gender neutral per neighborhood. So there's 3 per floor of that arrangement. So
it was really hard to figure it. I could not see for the life of me.
All you're seeing in those other images are blocks that were a little bit undefined, and since those were made, we've actually put a lot more walls and doors and fixtures to the paper, and it's a lot more defined now. So it's.
Chris, are you able to share that? Do you have that available or no?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if you're a co-host or not. Just the latest and greatest.
Let's see if I can zoom in here and show you. See that each neighborhood has a boys, girls, and then a gender neutral. So that's the same for all the neighborhoods, and then separate teacher facilities as well. So a lot of bathrooms.
Ms. Lawson, you had a hand up.
Ms. Lawson's on. You're muted. Sorry.
Okay, let me try it again. I wanted to return to the schedule. So Tuesday, April 27th is a public hearing for the Finance Committee in advance of the town meeting on May 1st. And I'm on this committee as a representative from the Finance Committee. I cannot miss the public hearing, so I cannot attend on the 27th. I don't know if that's an issue for any other members, and I don't know what to do about that. It's just a conflict that is not resolvable for me.
This is Jeff Fisher. It's an issue for me as well.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Ms. Lawson as well. Ms. Gallivan, you had a hand up.
Okay, along with that, often members of the school committee need to attend that same public hearing. I'm not sure that's going to be the case this spring, but we often are there because our budget's getting presented at town meeting. I was surprised to hear so many bathrooms. Like we were talking about consolidating space. Is that normal to have 9 student bathrooms for a school, or 9 sort of sets of student bathrooms for a school of this size?
Yeah, those are the code minimums.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
It's fixture count, correct, Chris?
Yep.
So on the week of the 27th, we could probably do a poll to see if there's another night that might work better. That we were trying to avoid select board meetings Tuesdays, I think. Tony, these are all Tuesdays, correct?
Yes, they're all Tuesdays at 7 right now. Maybe that week we do it on a Wednesday, or try and squeeze it in.
Yeah, we can do a poll for what works better.
Yeah, I'll send out a poll for this particular one, 4/27, and maybe pick a Wednesday and the following week on a Tuesday. We only have one meeting in May, so maybe there's an opportunity. I'll look at that, and I won't confirm 4/27 as a date. So just as a preview, our next meeting on 3/30 will be an important one for anyone interested in traffic, because the TAPA's consultant will be doing a presentation about this preliminary study that was included in the PSR. And then in April, we are going to be looking at bathrooms a little more closely, because we'll be looking at the developed architectural plans and talk a little bit about materials and what a school might look like from the outside. And then we're going to get into some nitty-gritty on mechanicals at the end of April. So you will be seeing those bathrooms again in a little more detail for those that are interested. So I'll go ahead and confirm all these dates except 4/27, and I'll distribute a poll for that night. And I appreciate everyone looking at their schedules now, because it really is good to have all the dates just down on a calendar and just be working on the actual design work rather than kind of scheduling meetings.
Yeah, Mr. Jeffrey Fisher, please.
Just one comment on the public hearing. I believe it starts at 6. So, do you recall, Sue?
I think it is at 7. I couldn't swear to it. Generally is at 7, but there's no way we should schedule these two things on the same night, in my opinion, because the public hearing could be perfunctory. It could be 3 hours. You never know what you're going to get. It's like the box of chocolates.
If I could just chime in, this is Jim Johnson. Everyone is correct. It's at 7 o'clock.
Thanks, Jim. All right, so I'll definitely send out a doodle poll for 4/27, but I will go back in and attribute the 7 o'clock time to these, so you'll get an update in your calendar. You get a bunch of updates tomorrow, and you can just confirm, so that way we all have them.
Thank you, Mr. Pena. Do we have any final questions or comments? Anything else from you, Mr. Jarvis?
Oh, that's it.
Very good.
30th with the updates you see there.
Very good. So I don't get to make the motion, but if I could please ask for a motion to adjourn. We have too many people spoke. Ms. Gallivan, did you make a motion?
I sure will.
Very good. Do we have a second?
Second.
And we have a second from, I'm not certain who that was from.
Lawson.
Ms. Lawson?
Yeah.
All right, very good. If I could poll the committee, please. Ms. Gallivan?
Yes.
Ms. Lawson?
Yes.
Mr. Goff?
Yes.
Mr. Jack Fisher?
Yes.
Mr. Senek?
Yes.
Mr. Frisha?
Yes.
Ms. Santiago Taylor,
Yes.
Mr. Hahn,
Yes.
Ms. Gaositz,
Yes.
Mr. Connor,
Yes.
Mr. Jeffrey Fisher,
Yes.
Mr. Conroy,
Yes.
and I vote yes. Did I miss anybody? Very good. It is a vote. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good night now.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.